Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. How are y'all doing? You should be hearing this about February, so we're in the second month of 2022. How's it going? The first month was a little bit bumpy. Today's episode, I'm talking with Jen Perry, and we're answering listeners' questions. And the question that we're looking at today is, what are things that you can do when you're new to a group that doesn't understand high sensitivity? And Jen and I have a really nice conversation about this. I think you're going to enjoy it. I'm really not going to say too much. I think I just want to get to the show. So now, on to the show. Hey, Jen, how's it going?
Hi, Patricia.
It has been quite a day for us, hasn't it?
Oh, my goodness. So Mercury's in retrograde or something?
Well, it's 9 o'clock or 9:10 now your time. It's 6:10 my time. We sat down to record at 10:30, spent an hour and a half using Squadcast. There was static on the line. Then we went to GarageBand, and then we had problems exporting it. And then we went to Riverside FM just to practice. But by the time we got on Riverside FM, we didn't have time to record, and we just had to scrap everything and regroup. So we get an A for flexibility and letting things go, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. My favorite qualities. Yeah,
Yep.
We did a good job rolling with it for sure.
And then we had a great little chat before we got on, but unfortunately, it's not anything we can talk about on here. So we'll just have to smile and laugh and enjoy our little conversation.
Let's go right to it.
Okay. So I'm going to read the first part of the question. So the question is from a listener, things to be mindful of when being new to a group that doesn't understand high sensitivity. So what are your thoughts, Jen?
Things to be mindful of. Okay, I think I walk into most settings with that assumption, right? Because if you're entering a room of 10 people, help me out, maths is not my strong suit, right? But it's going to be at the most 2 people in there, and you're one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the other person, right? I think the most important thing is to keep front and center, like your own grounding, right? Your own sense of what your needs are, and that to be able to be assertive about those, whether they're needs or whether they're boundaries. And, if it's a brand new group of people, I think that there are ways to be kind of subtle about that, but really giving yourself permission to take care of yourself.
Yeah. Probably early on when I learned I was a highly sensitive person, I probably led a lot with wanting people to know because I was so excited about it. As I've grown into really embracing my traits, I don't feel like that's something I need to lead with. It's not like I'd go in and go, I'm a Leo. I'm an Enneagram. This is my Myers-Briggs personality. I don't lead with that. It's a way that we communicate. And if that works for you, or you have a friend that has the same whatever it is that matches yours, then you know that you speak the same language. But like Jen said, if I know that the lights are too bright, or maybe there's background music that's too loud, I don't need to go, I'm a highly sensitive person, and that's, my sensitivity to subtleties is running a little high right now. I can just say, hey, can we turn that down a little bit? So when we know what our traits are and what we need, we can come from a place of asking to have those needs met without having to lead with the fact that we're highly sensitive.
I like that. As much as when we talk about high sensitivity all the time, I mean, if you're meeting a new group of people, they want to know the whole you. Maybe. I'm really curious what kind of to give this some context, So is this like a work group? Or I think sometimes focusing on the task at hand and bringing yourself, including your sensitivity to that task, and staying grounded, like I was saying, in what you need and what your boundaries are. Once you have that down and you understand yourself and the trait, I know this was true for me. I wasn't trying to convince anyone or even educate anybody that necessarily, unless they were interested. It was really just asserting the boundaries or the needs, whether it's like you were saying, environmental with the lights, or even just, taking charge of the conversation a little bit for yourself. If there are things that you just don't want to talk about, or I know I was working with a highly sensitive child and, COVID times, right? Like her class would watch a movie, I guess during lunch or recess or something. And often the movie had those kinds of scenes that were HSPs have a hard time with, whether they're violent or, and in the middle of her school day, it was really upsetting. She did a brilliant job of really letting and not apologizing for them, just letting it be known that it is what it is and really learning that self-advocacy. So I think when you're in these situations, it's important to kind of, what are your expectations for yourself in these settings, right? And to really get clear about that, I would say it's to take care of yourself and then get to know whoever, you're there with and whatever purpose it is that you're gathering together. But to just get really clear, like this isn't necessarily the time to, talk about it or educate people about it. Obviously, if there's an opening and it's the right, read the room, right? Like, that's not necessarily what you're going to go front and center with.
Right. I think too, and without having context around what this is, and that is the challenge when we take listener questions. We love answering them, but we always don't know what the context is. That there's always this period of trying to figure out what the group norms are, what are the rules, the unspoken rules, and trying to figure out what that is. And I think that can be challenging for anybody, regardless of who you are. And I know that I've talked a little bit about joining this paddling group and trying to figure out, how do I show up? And part of it is nice that I don't have to show up as the therapist and the expert. And it's sort of been nice to be sort of a follower. But I also know that we meet for coffee after our Wednesday paddles. And one time I shared this story about my son. I think it's a beautiful story of the intimacy that we have. But I
remember that story. That was a good one. See, I love that story. If I was there and we were strangers, I would have been all about it.
Right. I don't have his permission to share it, but either I have no boundaries in my family or my son has an immense sense of trust for me. And I shared this story and somebody in the group changed the subject and moved on to something else. And I had a little bit of like an internal shame attack of like, ooh, that was too much. And maybe it was, or maybe it wasn't. But I want to validate and acknowledge that when we do go into new groups, we're trying to figure out how much can we share and what can we share? And do I use that as an earmark of, ooh, those kinds of stories are like, maybe not for this group, or maybe the person just felt uncomfortable. Maybe somebody else felt okay with it. So I do want to validate that there is this process of trying to figure out what is tolerable in this group. And the other thing that I hear a lot from my clients is, especially if you're introverted or you're someone that sits back a little bit more, you don't want to have to fight to speak. It can be hard when there are big personalities or people that are extroverted or very opinionated, because in general, most HSPs hang back a little bit. They're processing very, very deeply and they're really actively engaged. But because the standard is the non-highly sensitive extrovert, people expect everybody to jump in and just fend for themselves. And that, HSPs are kind of about polite turn taking. I always think of Chip and Dale, after you, no, you, please, after you. It doesn't work that way in the real world.
No, it doesn't. I think one thing to be mindful of, to piggyback on what you're saying, is that when we enter into these, and I am assuming it's a new group as I read this question, we tend to kind of take in like the whole group. And really, if we look at that, that's probably those one or two like really big personalities. If you look at the group as, a collection of individuals, who's also hanging back, right? Who's also maybe not necessarily struggling, but viewing it as a collection of individuals and maybe honing in on an individual or two as you get to know the group and its norms.
And if you have a history with groups or not feeling seen and heard or feeling that there's something wrong with you, there's that confirmation bias. Our brains look for the danger in the environment to make sure that we're safe. And if I have a wound of I'm being too much, or I talk too much, or people don't like me, or I annoy people, my brain is going to be looking for any evidence of that. So I may look at somebody's facial expressions and confirm that, see, they're annoyed with me. I mean, it's almost like a little bit of this example that I gave you. The person changed the subject. Maybe I'm being too much. And so when we can recognize that we have that confirmation bias and we may be looking for evidence of how we don't fit in or what supports our wounds, we need to have an awareness of that and change that message to ourselves. And like Jen said, I mean, I love the story, Jen, of I have this wound of every couple of months I go this, like, I don't have friends and nobody likes me. It's not the truth. It's just what goes on for me. And I went through this a few months ago and I was telling Jen via video that this is what I was going on. She's like, well, why didn't you reach out and call me? And my response was, that didn't fit my confirmation bias. My story was, I don't have any friends. And if I would have called you, then that would have validated that I had friends. I mean, that's exactly how it plays out with us.
Yes, absolutely. In the moment, right? And then cultivating that awareness or cultivating, ways to really look for the opposite, right? Which is, not necessarily something where it's going to come to us in the moment. I'm laughing a little bit here because I had a moment, right? So after going through a divorce where I'm like, oh my God, I'm middle-aged. I haven't dated in 20 years. I'm like, nobody's ever going to find me attractive ever again. And of course, that's not true. That's a lie. But at the time, boy, I'll tell you what, it felt true. And actively, I decided, okay, that's it. I got to prove to myself that this is not true. Even though I was not looking to date, I wanted to give myself a good year. I put a profile up on Facebook dating and I disproved it to myself. So, the question is what to be mindful of, right? So I think that's brilliant to be mindful of your confirmation bias. If you have the wherewithal, and, again, this is where having that HSP, I know I say this all the time, having that person, and I think Patricia and I, you're that person for me a lot of the time, that kind of safe, place to bounce a lot of this stuff off of. And half the time when we're talking to each other, the answers come. It's not like just from that reflection, but being mindful going into these situations and debriefing about them. And then just taking whatever next little step you can the next time.
Yeah. And I think if your expectation is that you will not feel uncomfortable, you will not feel awkward, you will not have doubts, you probably will hate going into new situations. That part of what I love about my relationship with you, Jen, and what I've established with a number of close friends is that it's very average for us to talk about the crazy thoughts that go on in our heads or the fears and the doubts. And it's not that it's running the show, but that's just part of the chatter that goes on. And when you're early in working on your healing, the voices are very, very loud and they can be debilitating. But what happens is over time, the voices get smaller and smaller. And we were just talking about today, I'm in the middle of writing a book, and every day I resist writing my 1,000 words. I just don't want to. It's hard. So the gremlins come up with, this is stupid. Nobody's going to want to read your book. I think I talked about this on our last recording too. So more gremlins. I'm not going deep enough. I mean, I have all this stuff coming up and it's like, okay, thanks for sharing. And I'm going to sit down and write and I'm going to get my 1,000 words out. And then once it's out, then I can adjust and add or delete or whatever I need to do. But if I listen to those gremlins, I wouldn't be writing a book. So what happens is over time, we learn how to turn the volume down and know that what I need to do is to do the next indicated step. That's where my healing comes from. It's not the fact that I still have the gremlins coming up and I have to figure out how to stop them. It's just that I learn how to put them in the back seat. As Elizabeth Gilbert says, we're going on a trip and they don't get to use the GPS. They don't get to choose what we're listening to on the radio. They get to sit in the back seat. So they're coming along, but they're not going to be riding shotgun.
That's right. Big magic. I love that chapter. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love what you said just there. I think that is a really important thing to articulate. Like, what does a healing journey look like? It's really important to know that it's not the absence of what we call those like automatic thoughts, that programming, that, gremlins. It's not the absence of those. That's not where your healing's at, right? In fact, I'm not sure we can do a whole heck of a lot about that knee-jerk first set of reactions, right? We're not even in control of it, right? Like we don't will it, right? So our free will and our space to grow happens in what happens right after that, right? So not what our first thought is, but what our second, third, fourth, fifth thought is, and how we react and approach ourselves with compassion, and curiosity, and so and letting yourself be in process. I throw it right out there now. I'm just like, yeah, I'm awkward. I'm going to try to have this conversation with you, one human being to another. And you know what? I find HSP or no, like 90, I don't know, maybe 90% of the time, the other person is like, oh my God, you just said it. I don't have to fake with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so happy.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the best icebreaker. Now, look, I'm going to get somebody mad at me because it's going to be that 10% of the time where it backfires. But I've also noticed that that person that it backfires with is really often just really defended.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was talking with a client today, and this client has something that I don't work with but needs to be addressed. And so the client has found another therapist to work on this specialty thing. And when we were talking today, the client was saying how difficult it is when they work with this other therapist. They haven't developed trust yet, and they feel really raw and exposed. And there's this new information that comes up, and they don't know how to process it. They don't know how to assimilate it. And it makes them feel like kind of undone. And we talked about that that's okay. That's part of the process, especially when you're early on in your healing recovery. And this is an area I've worked with this client for almost 4 years, and we've done amazing work. And there's this one area that's not my area of specialization. And so we talked about you're starting out new with this person. You don't have that sense of trust, and you are going to feel kind of undone, and you don't have anything to attach these experiences to. And that's part of the process. So, how can we focus on you allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable in a way that's manageable, but you don't have to live in it all day, as opposed to, for this client, they tend to get busy and productive because that's how they've had to manage their trauma. And so I think that's really important to know that when you start your healing process, it can be really uncomfortable. And all this stuff that you've been living with now has a name, and you're looking at things and your reality is changing, and it can be incredibly uncomfortable. And it's part of the process.
Yes. Yeah. Starting to make friends with some of that discomfort, right? The discomfort's not dangerous. They're so rich with information for us.
Yeah. I mean, what do you tell your clients when you start working with them and they have that sense of like, ugh, this is a lot?
Let's see. So I was working with a client today whose, main defense was to try to really understand things intellectually, like most of us. I could totally relate to that. In IFS therapy, that's internal family systems, it's the holding ourselves with compassion is where the healing is, right? It's not the intellectual understanding, although that's certainly satisfying and a piece of it. So a metaphor that we kind of came up with was, she's been on this rickety raft on the ocean for a long time. It doesn't feel safe, but it's what she knows. And in trying to get her into a really good raft, right, there's this really terrifying moment where you've got to let go of that rickety one and move over into trying something else, trying a different pattern, or trying a different behavior, trying a lot of different things, even just approaching yourself differently, trying to let go. And this is, someone that's middle-aged and older. You've got a whole lifetime here of framework to let go of and to really try something new. And that can just feel really, really terrifying. So we want to validate that there's these moments on the journey that can feel really scary. And while, we have to each walk our paths ourselves, we don't have to do that alone.
Yeah. I always have clients. So right now, listeners, if you're driving, don't do this, but cross your arms. And then cross your arms the other way. And it's uncomfortable. And we become comfortable with what's familiar, even when it causes us pain and suffering. And so this is to jump on Jen's analogy of the raft, of you're on this rickety raft that's comfortable and familiar, but is causing you suffering and may go down at any moment. Or you have an opportunity to get into a new raft, but you're not used to the new raft and you don't know how it's going to float, and you have to get from here to there. And it's a new kind of uncomfortable and familiar. It's doable, but it just means switching to something that's not as familiar and comfortable, but long-term may end up being amazing. But that unknown can be really challenging and scary for us.
So scary. Really want to validate that.
Yeah. Jen, we need to wrap up. We've got just another couple minutes. Anything in closing that you want to say?
Well, I kind of like to go back and visit the question itself, right? Things to be mindful of when being new to a group that doesn't understand high sensitivity. I hope that through our conversation, we've done this question some justice. I don't know if there's a way to invite the listeners, if they do want to give more context around the questions, it can help us be more specific. If I'm not sure here after the day I've had, I can actually go through and recap everything. although I know you'll do show notes and stuff like that. Being mindful, you could say staying curious. You can say supporting yourself with compassion, letting yourself be a beginner, letting yourself not know. That's part of the terrifying part of it too. It's like being in that space of uncertainty. And so whenever we're in an uncertain situation, we're going to have some feels.
Yeah. And depending on the nature of the group, it may be a group that you have to be a part of. But if it's not, are these my people? Do these people get me? Do they understand me? I think so much of our history is about trying to fit into places that we don't belong and wanting them to like us. But do we like them? Are they people that we want in our lives? Do they have the same values that we have? Obviously, if it's a group that you have to be in for work, then that's a little bit different. But even then, you can go, these people don't share my values and I have to show up and play nice. But these aren't my people and the people that I would choose to spend time with in my free time. And that can take the pressure off also that we just have to go along to get along in certain situations. And in other places, we really get to choose where we want to fit and belong and who we want to allow to fit and belong in our lives.
Absolutely. I was just having a conversation with a younger person today about job interviewing. They were interviewing the job as much as the job was interviewing them. And sometimes shared several stories of me bombing interviews. And it's the best thing that could have happened to me.
Sure.
Because I didn't belong there.
Right.
Or it wouldn't have been a good situation.
Right. Jen, we need to wrap up. I'm sorry.
Not at all. Not at all.
All right. Thanks for being here today, Jen. I appreciate it. And thanks so much to the listener for this great question. Hey again. So I'm curious to know, what did you think? I love having these conversations with Jen. I love that we have a different take on things, and it's just nice to see the perspective between the two of us. I'm curious to know, how is it for you when you join new groups? Is it challenging? Is it easy? What things come up for you? If you've been in therapy, what are the things that are easy? What are the things that are challenging? I definitely think that finding a therapist that's knowledgeable about the trait of being an HSP can really be invaluable. I'm just biased that way, though. If there's anything that you heard that resonated, if you're having struggles with relationships, with parenting, boundaries, joining in groups, wanting to know more about your trait of being a highly sensitive person, relationships seem to be a big challenge for HSPs. Any of that stuff, and you want extra support, Jen and I both see clients. We both do coaching and therapy. So if you're I think Jen is licensed in Philadelphia. You can find Jen at heartfulnessconsulting.com. I'm licensed in California. I'm really doing primarily coaching these days, so I can work with anybody individually all over the world. You can reach out to me at my website, unapologeticallysensitive.com. All my contact information is there, and you can go straight through my website. My hope is that you are feeling satisfied, fulfilled, content. You're having time for yourself, time to gently move your body, time to rest, time for fun and play. And if this is a hard time in your life right now, we are on year 3 of this pandemic, or panini, and people are having a really hard time, and it makes sense. So if you're not okay, it's okay to not be okay. I'm assuming that you're safe and you're maybe struggling, but not seriously where I should be concerned about you. Please know there's support. It's okay to be wherever you're at right now. These are hard times. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.